I think it's fair to say that with the high concept storylines of WandaVision and Loki, it seemed as though The Falcon and the Winter Soldier was going to be the most mundane of the new Disney Plus shows. Now that the series is over, however, I'd argue that not only does it outrank WandaVision, but it also sets a new bar against which all of the new MCU shows will be judged against. And before we get into the full rundown of why I think Falcon and the Winter Soldier absolutely knocked it out of the park, just want to say, thanks for swinging by my channel. A sub would make my day, so thank you in advance for that. And if you're feeling extra generous, a like would be fantastic as well. So, much like WandaVision, Falcon and the Winter Soldier is greatly tied to the events of Avengers Endgame, but whereas the former tackles the idea of grief, particularly for a life lost before its time, the latter is all about what it means to step into the shoes of someone who has an almost legendary reputation. It's here that the story picks up for Sam Wilson, aka the show's titular Falcon, as he decides to donate Captain America's shields to the US government, feeling that it's just too closely associated with the legacy of Steve Rogers that it wouldn't be right for him to wield it. Now, this could have been an interesting story in and of itself about how to navigate that kind of internal conflict, but the show goes one step further by injecting some tremendous social commentary, particularly about the history of African Americans and what it means to live as an African American in a country that has shown them so much hatred. It's not treated in a haphazard way either, as the story of Isaiah Bradley, a black superhero who was treated with nothing but disdain by the American government, is really heartbreaking to hear, and it just goes to show how well these MCU shows can tell more personal stories like this, because they're not rushing to meet a runtime. Even though the show began filming in late 2019, its writing feels as though it could have been constructed alongside the major headlines about racial inequality in 2020. And this sense isn't exclusive to just Sam's story, however, as it also applies to a huge newcomer in the show, John Walker, who is also known as the new, but brief, Captain America. John's attempt to live up to Steve's legacy leads him down a very different path to Sam, one that ends up with him taking the super serum that made Steve strong. Unlike with Steve, however, the serum only exacerbates John's temper, effectively removing his moral filter that would otherwise stop him from going too far. This results in a jaw-dropping scene where John brutally murders someone in broad daylight, and it's impossible not to draw comparisons with the countless instances of police brutality caught on film. But the fallout of this scene ties back in with the show's action, as John engages Sam and Bucky in one of the series' best fights. The stakes feel incredibly high, as you've just seen the devastation that John can wreak, and so in the process of all of this, the show ends up creating one of the MCU's most terrifying villains to date. Outside of Thanos and Loki, the MCU has had a bit of trouble with keeping villains around long enough to build them up as a threat. But with John surviving the events of this show and Agatha Harkness technically surviving the events of WandaVision, the MCU could be gearing up to have its own version of the Dark Avengers, which makes a lot of sense because, let's face it, how else are you going to top Thanos? The only character who fails to really stand out here is the Winter Soldier. Now, don't get me wrong, it's fun to see his interactions with Baron Zemo, and it's great to see the wider universe utilised here as we see Bucky's connections with Wakanda come into play, but the culmination of his story of trying to right the wrongs of his former self just doesn't hit with the same sort of magnitude that Sam's story does. That has a lot more at stake and I think a lot more to say. Whereas, yeah, Bucky's not so much. I mean, there are great Winter Soldier stories in the MCU, but this just isn't one of them. However, I consider this to be a minor blip on what is still a fantastic show, and one that's not afraid to tackle the tough questions, particularly in humanizing its antagonists, the rather laughably named Flag Smashers. After all, their wish for a more open world that doesn't turn a blind eye to refugees makes a lot of sense, and the show doesn't shy away from addressing that sentiment. Pretty heavy stuff for the MCU, but it just goes to show how much potential there still is to tell great stories within this existing framework. We're just a few weeks away from the premiere of Loki, and while I'm certainly excited for the show, it's hard to imagine it dethroning the Falcon and the Winter Soldier. But who knows, maybe I'll come to regret those words, as I know for a fact that there's plenty of people out there who didn't enjoy the show, and heck, if you're among them, then I'd like to know why. Maybe there's something that I missed. However you feel, please let me know in the comments below.